let me now say officially good afternoon and welcome everybody to the second in the series of our webinars that are complementing the Central and Eastern European and Central Asia Business and Human Rights Summer Academy, which we held earlier in the year. This Summer Academy program is complemented, set by the series of 4 webinars, which we've decided to make open to the broader audience from the region, simply because the issues that we are touching during those go much further than just to the business and human rights community. Today, we'll look into the issues around ethical principles of business and non-governmental organizations cooperation. And we have some really fantastic speakers with us today. And after that, we will have time for questions and answers. And you do have a possibility to ask those questions and answers already during the session by writing them in the Q&A section, or if you prefer in the chat, but we would like to encourage you to use the Q&A session, as it will keep those questions in one place. And it will be also possible for our speakers, for our panelists to answer them as we go, if there will be space for that already during the discussions. So what we will look at today, today we'll discuss how NGOs, how non-governmental organizations take the decisions about with whom to work, with whom to cooperate, and on what conditions, but also from whom to accept funding, particularly in our region. Little funding coming from independent donors, and very often there is hardly any core funding from the governments, or if it is available, then there are some strings attached. Very often NGOs are turning to the business sector for support, for cooperation, to be able to carry out their statutory activities. But is it always okay to do so? Can you cooperate with whoever you wish? Or should you actually try to assess if it is okay to cooperate with a specific entity? Because, well, if you are an organization that, for example, promotes health, perhaps going to Philip Morris or some other cigarette producing company for funding is not necessarily the best idea, as in a way you are helping to greenwash, in a way, this company. But on the other hand, we know that the NGOs do need to cooperate simply to be able to carry out their statutory activities, to be able to carry out their mission. They need to engage with individuals, they need to engage with organizations. So yeah, I mean, what are the values that should be guiding us when we are selecting with whom to cooperate? Then another element that is putting pressure on organizations, not only in our region, but more generally, there is this pressure from donors who are often suggesting that NGOs should diversify their income to fund statutory activities. So perhaps they shouldn't rely so much on the government funding if they were doing so, but that they should look out for this external funding. And in a way, of course, NGOs' activity is regulated by law. So we do need to obviously comply with different provisions. We need to submit both narrative reports describing what we are doing, how we are doing it, but also describing the financial situation. So we do need to carry out financial reporting. So in a way, there is some level of transparency involved because we need to stick with the rules, with the laws of the country. But then law is not regulating the sphere of with whom we want to work. So this is really left to the self-regulation. And the question is really, do we need this self-regulation? Or is it okay just to have values and just act on case-by-case basis when deciding every time when we take a decision about specific action, about specific project, to kind of decide what would be the best way forward? So yeah, this is basically what we'll be talking about today. simply because in order for NGOs to maintain trust of the society in that what they are doing is really just and that we are true to ourselves when we are conducting those activities, we need to make sure that we don't abuse this trust, that we are staying transparent at the level that is expected by our stakeholders, by the society. And in a way, self-regulation is one of the ways to ensure this transparency. The question is, how far should it go? Do we need some very precise procedures telling exactly what we need to do when, at what stage? Or is it, as I've said at the beginning, is it enough to have values and just kind of do our best to apply them in practice when taking individual decisions? And obviously, those are the issues that not only we, NGOs in Poland are struggling with, those are the issues that obviously are coming up in reality in the functioning of the NGOs also in other countries. And we have with us today also speakers from Iceland. We are also joined by Elena Uwarova. And we do have the fantastic speakers also from Poland, from two very big organizations in Poland, Maciej Nowicki and Katarzyna Batko-Tołuć. So Helsinki Foundation and Sieć Obywatelska Watchdog. So as mentioned, I've done it already briefly, but let me introduce our panelists in more detail now. And also introduce how we'll go today about the webinar. We'll start with a presentation by Sevar Ari Finnbogason, who is a board member of ALDE, Association for Sustainable Democracy from Iceland, based in Reykjavik. He's also a PhD student in the University of Iceland at the Faculty of Philosophy, History, and Archaeology, but also a lecturer at Bifrost University in Iceland. And Sevar is specializing in issues around political philosophy, democracy, democratic theory, but also participatory and deliberative democracy, as well as political ethics and critical thinking. And his organization has been involved in the discussions around ethical conduct of NGOs in Iceland. Then, as mentioned, we do have also with us Katarzyna Batko-Tołuć, who is a program director and the board member of the Citizens Network Watchdog Poland. And this organization, through litigation, advocacy, and building a grassroots social movement, this organization aims at enforcing freedom of information, freedom of speech, transparency of government, and accountability of decision-making. And Katarzyna is also a member of the EU-Russia Civil Society Forum Solidarity Group and International Advisory Board of Access Info Europe, and as well Ashoka Fellow. So she also has an idea not only about Poland, but also kind of has a better understanding, good understanding of the region. And we do have with us also another person who has a great insight into what's going on in Poland, is leading the oldest, probably the oldest NGO working on human rights in Poland. So we do have with us Maciej Nowicki, who is the president of the board of the Helsinki Foundation for Human Rights, which is a Polish leading human rights NGO in Central and Eastern Europe. Maciej is a lawyer, an expert on human rights and the rule of law, but also on the documentary film. And he conducted training sessions, gave lectures, and participated in various discussions on human rights issues. But for us, he's most strongly always connected with international film festivals on human rights. He's a co-founder and was in the past also the director of the International Film Festival Watchdogs, which was held or is held in Warsaw since 2001. So without further ado, I'll give the floor now to Sevar, who will talk to us about how NGOs in Iceland are trying to deal with these issues of trust, transparency, and kind of having this guiding, I'd say, compass to lead them through the decisions requiring some ethical conception. And then we'll move to the discussion with our other panelists, and then we'll have also the space for discussion with our participants. Thank you. Sevar,
thank you, Beata, and it's great to see you again. And I want to start by trying to share my screen here. Let's see, you should now see my screen if I'm not mistaken.
We can see it very well. Yes,
yes.
Fantastic.
Great. So I want to start with perhaps a little context to explain, because the topic of my little talk here is going to be about codified well, codes of conduct or ethics and transparency, and how we are trying to work with those tools here in Iceland. And perhaps the situation here is a bit unusual, and to explain why, I think I need to give a little background. The picture you see here on the screen is actually the venue for our first workshop. We had a workshop here in Reykjavik, and which was really interesting. We had tremendous discussions about where representatives of different NGOs participated, and so we got a very good sort of cross-section of NGOs and many different views, and an insight into the challenges in this area. Olena, who is present here, was one of the speakers at this workshop, and of course Beata was there as well. So these were actually two workshops, because the discussion in the first workshop showed, at least to my way of thinking, that there are some issues with codes of conduct here in Iceland, and the main question that we kept coming back to is whether or not these codes should be seen as a disciplinary tool or a guiding light in terms of, what kind of an organization are we, what are our values, and so on, or whether they should be something that can be used to really run the organization, to intervene, or for example, if an employee does something wrong, then can the person be reprimanded, and so on. So, and I'll come back to this, but this is the reason why we had two sessions. We had a follow-up workshop in September. So one thing to keep in mind is that NGOs are not just one thing. I mean, they are different. They are doing different tasks. Some of them are they provide a public good, some service. They are funded, like here in Iceland, partly by the state, and then by members and donations. These might typically be organizations that provide something like support for cancer patients or the elderly or something like that. And then you have, of course, the labor unions, who are funded by the members, but they are more formal and a part of a very structured labor market here in Iceland, which is sort of the Scandinavian model that we have here. So, and then we have NGOs like ALTA, for example, which are mainly, human rights, environmental protection, and so on. So just to put this in context, and for, these are different organizations, and I will also come back to that. There are lots of promises I'm making here at the beginning of this talk. But to understand why things are as they are in Iceland, I think we need to go back in time to the financial crisis of 2008, where the Icelandic financial system collapsed in a very spectacular way. All the major banks in Iceland went bankrupt, and these banks had subsidiaries and branches all over Europe. And so this was a tremendous economic collapse, one of the biggest in history. But the prevailing sentiment at the time was that public and private institutions had failed in various ways in safeguarding the public interest. And this was seen as an ethical failure of those elites, you know, driven by a combination of greed and nepotism and cronyism and irresponsible risk-taking. So there was this sentiment that there was something wrong, and that problem was a moral failure. So there was a lot of talk about this, and one of our partners is actually Salvor Nordal, who was one of the people who wrote the report that dealt with the sort of ethical side of what happened here in Iceland, the events that led to this financial collapse. And this report had a huge impact on the discussion here in Iceland. So the focus was very much on the sort of ethical side of things. And following this, all manner of organizations in Iceland started to set themselves a code of ethics. And I'm using the word code of ethics to sort of highlight that the ethical emphasis of these codes here in Iceland. Usually we talk about this as codes of conduct, but I mean, that's the normal way of talking about this, I think. Well, I think, you know, as Beata mentioned in her introduction, these can be seen as a sort of internal self-regulation versus, you know, external. And here in Iceland, we have probably one of the most developed human rights and equality, for example, gender equality, trans rights, and so on. It's probably one of the most developed in the world. And Iceland consistently ranks as one of the most gender equal countries in the world. So, if not the most, actually, this is something that we have actually managed for a number of years. So these things are actually, you know, on the surface of things, this all looks very well, looks very good. And when it comes to transparency and accounting and so on, we have the full stack of EU regulations through our membership of the European Economic Area. So we have all the regulatory framework that you would see in any other advanced European country. And it's sometimes said that we Scandinavians are more religious than the Pope when it comes to EU regulations. And well, on the surface, like I said, that applies to Iceland as well. So any problems? I mean, this all looks very good. And then we have all these codes of conduct in place. Well, as the picture that you see on the screen suggests, then yes, there might be some problems still, even though we have all these formal tools in place. And but I don't want to, because I don't have a lot of time, then I don't want to sort of go into all that background, but we can discuss that later in the Q&A. But when it comes to codes of ethics, what our discussion in the workshops and the report bears out is that there are two main approaches, and I have, for convenience, labeled those as the disciplinary approach and the guiding light approach. So to distinguish the two, if we just look at these two approaches, then the disciplinary approach to codes of ethics is that those usually have some clear mechanisms to enforce the rules. So you might, for example, have some set procedures, you know, if someone does X, then Y happens. Or you have ethical or sort of ethics committees, which are sort of, you know, they have sometimes been called tribunals by people who don't like this approach. And to some extent that might be true, actually. And an example of this in Iceland would be Almannaheill, which is a sort of collective organization of NGOs in the third sector that provide public services. And these are usually rather big organizations that have lots of employees, and there is, of course, much more money involved in all of this than, for example, something like ALTA. Political parties, universities, and the Icelandic Parliament actually has a code of ethics with an ethics committee. Then the guiding light approach has seen more as a guide to help people to come to an agreement and understanding about what is expected in terms of good conduct when you are working for an NGO. And, you know, this is the approach that asks the question, what kind of an organization do we want to be? You know, how do we want to operate? How do we want others to see us? And how do we achieve these goals and values that we have set ourselves? So these are most useful if they are established and revised in a democratic way. And so this is very important. And I'll come back to that. This is starting to be my favorite phrase in this talk, but well, the disciplinary approach has been problematic, to say the least. And there are various reasons for this. I mean, it can become very cumbersome. There are all sorts of questions about who should sit on the ethical committees. If you approach a code of conduct or code of ethics in this way, they can often be difficult to apply because they may clash with law and other contractual obligations that people may have. You know, employer relationship is highly regulated, of course, as you know. So all of these things need to be considered, and the ethical rules can be sort of subordinate to all these other external commitments. So the more promising, to my way of thinking, approach to ethical rules is the guiding light approach. It has many good points to it, or many qualities. For example, it can be used to clarify the core values of the organizations. As I said before, what kind of an organization are we, and how do we want people to think of us? It can be used to clarify and put into context different duties and external regulations that apply to the context of your NGO and the field that you are working in. But codes of conduct that are little more than some internal memos or a web page on your organization's website are just simply mostly useless. No one will read them, people will simply not care, and if something happens, something comes up, people will, of course, first look to the internal rules and regulations of your organization and the external regulation that applies. So the magic is the process here. The process can work as a sort of a democratic empowerment within the organization, and it can serve as an impetus to and an occasion to sit down regularly to reflect on who we are and what we want to achieve. So I think that this is very useful, at least it has proven to be very useful where it has been applied and done in this way. But the casualty of this Icelandic approach that has sort of placed all this emphasis on ethics and moralizing, I would like to say, is that transparency, these codes of ethics are usually very vague on transparency. And as you probably know, the key question about transparency is, like Bayata mentioned before, how is the NGO funded, and is that transparent to people that you want to cooperate with? And this is, of course, a question of trust, both for people who are considering donating to your organization and working with your organization. And, also, I mean, there are all these questions about, who do we accept donations from? Should we accept, for example, if we're an environmental organization, should we be accepting donations from oil companies? Maybe this would not be clear to everyone. People might say, well, perhaps they're trying to mitigate the harm that they do. So what's wrong with, accepting money from Shell or something? But others might think, well, it goes against what we are fighting against. So, let's not do that. But there are also questions about, donations from businesses that don't treat their employers well, or, wage fraud, for example, and paying low wages, human trafficking allegations, and so on. Should we accept money from organizations or businesses like that? Usually, these kinds of things are, if they are addressed at all, which is usually not the case. There are exceptions to this, of course, but usually that's not the case. Then what the codes of ethics have to say about this is usually very vague, sort of very general terms, and usually this is addressed in the internal rules or constitution of the organization in question. So, and those, the laws of your organization might have some provisions about, not accepting money from businesses at all, or about transparency, how information about funders is made available to the public, and so on. And arguably, according to the participants in our workshop, this might actually be the best place for regulation of this kind, because it provides more clarity, and it is, of course, I mean, more, well, I hesitate to use the word, but it's more enforceable, should we say. But there is a notable exception to this, which is Almannaheill, which has, like I said before, this is a very big organization. All the major organizations that provide public service in Iceland belong to Almannaheill, and by belonging to this umbrella organization, they subject themselves to Almannaheill's code of ethics. I wonder if people working, on the floor in these member organizations have ever read the code of ethics of Almannaheill. I severely doubt that. But at least, this code of ethics has an article about finances that states that information about finances and operations must be transparent and presented in a simple and clear manner. And also, member associations are careful not to associate with entities that are contrary to their purposes and goals. And this is typical of the language in codes of this kind. But at least, this states goals and values that are important. So I'm not making light of that, and I'm not saying it's not worth doing. But the problem here is, as I said before, I think a code of ethics, which, like I was just saying, is stating some goals and aspirations, is of course not very well. It does a very limited job if the people whom this code applies to and should be working accordingly have no knowledge of what the code says. They might get an email, the code of ethics has been updated. And actually, Almannaheill just updated their code of ethics. They had one that had been in place for 10 years, and they updated it just this summer. And all that work was done by 3 experts. They sent out a memorandum asking for, any proposals or ideas, and which was largely ignored by everyone. So these experts just sat down and finished the job and published this update to their codes of ethics without probably, anyone in the member organizations knowing anything about it. So you might wonder what the value of this exercise is. So for some final thoughts, I think I'm pretty much okay for time. Yeah. So unlike these big organizations that provide public service and often receive at least some money from the state, and some support from business, because businesses like to be, of course, shown as donating to support for cancer patients and the elderly and whatever, something like that. So The main problems for organizations like ALTA, to which I belong, and some environmental protection organizations and things like that, organizations that are, you know, activists or deal with some human rights causes and things like that, is that they simply don't have access to other funds than membership funds. You know, that's usually the case in Iceland, and from what I've understand with discussions with the partners and Olena in our workshop, that seems to be sort of the case almost everywhere. You know, sometimes it happens that we are involved in something like this project, and that might provide some, you know, some money to do something, but other than that, we are mostly reliant on basically membership fees and money that the members actually provide to do certain things. The state does not give money to organizations like ALTA here in Iceland. Actually, we have had some financial support from labor unions in Iceland, because we have been highly involved in work and well, actually research. You know, we are moving more into that field in relation to the 4-day week campaign. And so, yeah, this is basically the situation. NGOs, activist NGOs are broke. You know, so there hasn't been much impetus or much reason for NGOs to sit down and write some detailed rules about transparency or donations here in Iceland, and I think that's probably the case in many more countries. So donations, whether or not to accept them, are just usually considered on a case-by-case basis. And moreover, these NGOs are usually so broke that, you know, it can take, you know, determination to say no to donations from business. And I think that's all. I would be happy to answer any questions you have in the discussions. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Savara, for this very detailed intro. And I'll go over to the Polish colleagues in a moment, but many thanks for setting this ground, how it looks like in Iceland. Also, because I think we often have this very idealistic vision that, as you've said, because it's a country that has a very strong legislation concerning human rights and gender issues and so on, that it's also the perfect picture also in other areas. And we see that a number of questions that the organizations are asking themselves or not asking themselves, it's pretty much the same catalog as we are having when we are talking about those issues in Poland. What I think was very important for me in what you've said is that even if codes of conduct, kind of like really precise procedures exist, unless you have internalized the values as an organization, unless your members internalize the values on which those codes are, very easy to circumvent it and just do what you want, disregarding the code. At the same time, what I found was very important is that some form of discussion is needed, after all, within the organization to be able to identify and agree on the core set of values that you want your organization to be based on. And so in a way, I really like the phrase which you had, that the magic is in the process, because I think that really reflects any change in any organization, be it business or NGO. So many thanks for your presentation, and we'll ask you also later on to join the discussion. But now I wanted to go over to first Katarzyna Batko-Tołuć and then to Maciej with pretty much the same question. So, I mean, obviously, if you could tell us very briefly about your organization first, but also whether you collaborate with other organizations and businesses when doing your work. Does such collaboration have financial dimension? And how do you go about deciding whether to collaborate with specific entity, be it kind of proactively in the ways that, okay, we've identified as an organization that we want to work with somebody and then you go, but also this kind of in a more passive way when it's the organization or funder or donors that is coming your way and say, we think you are doing a great job, for example, in your organization case, Katarzyna, trying to kind of demand transparency from the government. We want to support you here as a donation. But for example, it comes from the companies that, I don't know, had some issues with whistleblowers or slabs, and which itself is not necessarily transparent. So how do you go about it in your work?
Okay, thank you very much, Beata. So first I will present myself, Katarzyna Batko-Tołuć from the Citizens Network Watchdog Poland. And this is the organization created by citizens from the local communities that wanted to deal with corruption, like the big issue for the beginning of 2000s in Poland. Later on, it stopped to be that big, but sorry, but like people discovered that transparency and accountability is something that is a best protection against corruption. So this is mostly what we are doing right now. And from this locally based organization, we started to be kind of an advocate for the national advocate for these issues. And the topic very much determines how we think about our own transparency and our own values, because very often we enter to very politically, highly politicized topics. And we wanted, and it will refer to Sevar's presentations, sorry for, because not everything what you said was in question, Beata's question, but I think it matters that we have very high standard of transparency. Sometimes we are called fundamentalists, but I would only thank ourselves for what we did, for our investment since 2008, I would say, because we proved, we publish, just to give you an example. So it's not only about sources of funding that are presented in simple way, maybe not very attractive, but simple for sure. So when some organizations asked about their sources of funding, like the general sector in Poland says, everything is the financial report. I think it's not enough, because very often these financial reports are for the general public completely vague. They don't know what the numbers mean even, and not even every one of them has this list of donors and how much was spent from which donor. Like, it really depends. Organizations can present it in clearer or less clear way, I would say. This is not a standard that it has to be very clear. So we decided that we will just write how much we spent from each, like in the separate section in the special website about financing that we will put every year. When we will took out this data from the financial report, and we will put like separate section also showing what comes from grants and what comes from other sources. So this is one of the important things that I think we do to increase our transparency. Of course, this is not a problem that you have in Iceland, that we are only membership based. We, human rights organizations in Poland, but generally in the region, we are financed from abroad, and this is a bigger problem. So not public funding, but the fact that we are financed from abroad, and in the moment when I would say window of opportunity for those who want to criticize that, this is something that is, of course, used against us. But again, it's better anyway. People speak about it anyway. They say this is someone who is funded from abroad. So it's better to explain it and to show how much is it. And of course, it also somehow motivated us to have also other funding from people, membership or whatever, from donations, just to show that we have more diverse Polish-based funding. But generally, just to diminish the risk, and generally it is smaller, because always someone, like when there is a bigger discussion in social media, someone puts a finger at us and says, this is Soros, this is this and this, but and then everybody checks and says, they write about that. Like, you could read it, look at how many people saw it, because we also have a number of visitors. So generally, I find it rather as a better way of explaining yourself, and also it motivates us to have better policies inside. And about code of conducts that are actually not about that. This is something that we do understand. This is not written that, for example, we are not going to have more than 50% from foreign funding, or we are not going to have something, but we pay attention to the general picture for the public opinion that it's going to have. So maybe we should write it, but I'm afraid that it may be a moment when we can't keep it. So it's more about philosophy than about regulations, as we were thinking, as we were talking. Then the second thing that Beata asked about having money, and of course, when it came to the moment that we need money, we need other money, not foreign funding. Important thing, we decided not to take any public funding in 2010. So since that time, we only had an option, like Open Society Foundations, Batory Foundation, EEA grants, and not really, we are not Helsinki Foundation, who have much more diverse wallet of donors. Like, so it was really difficult for us to have some other donors, foreign donors. So it motivated us a lot to build communication towards citizens and to have money from citizens. And of course, as always, at the beginning of such processes, advisors say, yes, but you need to have money from business, you need to have major donors, because you work on you put a lot of effort into raising small money from several citizens, while you can have a lot of money from one major donor. Like now, after years, I know that actually the story is the same, more or less the same one for most of the human rights organizations. Major donors are non-existent for us. It's a risk, because the just people, I wouldn't even say just, but people who completely don't interfere into what you are going to do, giving you big money, even if they don't interfere, like, you have to agree something with them. And this is actually not the way how we think. Sorry, but I started. So we finally decided to have the micro donations model, like after a few trials, but it doesn't mean we don't cooperate with different institutions. So if you, Beata, say organizations, so of course we cooperate a lot with other NGOs, but I understand that this is a different class. So when you say organizations, you mean more like institutions, companies, and
kind of more, but I would say that for me, it is also important, like, how you select, other organizations with which you cooperate. But I kind of wanted to focus more on the institutions and business, because in a way, with other NGOs, it's kind of more obvious that it is some sort of collaboration that maybe, maybe I'm thinking it's the wrong way, but for me, it's kind of more obvious that you would kind of go along the way.
No one goes alone. I mean, depends on the topic, but this is not a bigger question of like, I can comment on that at the end. But about businesses and institutions that I can treat as one group, I just, because you asked me earlier, so I looked back to the proportions of, because in our financial report that I finally understand after years, there is this part on donations, and donations from physical persons and from legal entities. And then I tried to calculate what is the share of this private entities, legal entities, and it's in all donations, which are on the level now between 55,000 to 60,000 euros per year, this is 5 to 10%. And this 5 to 10% is done by also like by small donations from small companies that are not major donors. It's like €1,000 at the end of the year because they want to have some tax deduction, or it's done through this mechanism called called like the general, I just forgot the name now, which is obvious for me.
What's the idea?
Yeah, but anyway, the idea is that companies, I will just check how it is named, but the idea is that there is a mechanism to which different companies, usually big companies, can associate, and their employees can pay donations to the organizations that are accepted and on the list, and the company gives extra money to that. So from that, like from Google, for example, through this mechanism, we can have quite significant money, like 10,000 euros, for example, per year. So, but it goes through some mechanism. So it's not that we agree with the company, it's just that we are kind of accepted by this intermediary, and through this intermediary, we get money, and these are employees of the employer who decide which organization should be supported. So it's not that we have like someone who is a major donor. Then I was thinking about difficult questions that we encountered at some point, and then I looked. We didn't have many because of the way how we have it organized, also by accident. But I referred to a few situations from my professional life, from other organizations as well, and there were some cases. Like there was a case in one of the organizations that organization was approached by the loan company. But you know, the loan company sending money for a very high interest rate. Mm-hmm. And the organization was very open to cooperate. We will do something for young people. The program was very much, like, was almost developed, common program and so on. And then employees of the organization said, well, how come? We are going to cooperate with them. And there was such a resistance that the board of the organization had to resign, the management board. They decided, okay, if you are that much against, we are not going to do anything about it. Then we had another problem, a company that was actually, the company was pretty like respected, but they had a mobbing case. And this, you know, there are different cases, nothing was proved. The problem was that they sued the person, the journalist who was writing about that. And it was also a crime clause with which like everybody in Poland is fighting now. This is famous in Poland, Article 2012 from the criminal code. And this was something that couldn't allow us to, and actually we were even not talking with the company itself, but with someone who could possibly have money from this company and be kind of an intermediary, like raise its profit on someone's on this company's money. And we decided that this is too far. It's like that we don't have a clear proof that there is a connection, but we felt that uncomfortable with that. Of course, at some point we thought, oh, maybe we can spend this money on freedom of speech protection or something like that, but we couldn't explain it to ourselves. So finally we resigned. Also important is that we were not really pressed at that time to have this money. So, okay, you always want to have more money, but you can explain yourself that you will survive. So I'm not sure that we were that just. Might be that we were just not in high need. And then we also had similar case that shown us how important the labor rights are now important. Okay, strange sentence. It was we were cooperating with the public cultural institutions which gave us building for our rooms and meeting place for one of our celebrations. And because this was our celebration, so we were posting pictures on Facebook and so on. And then people came and they said, but don't you know that they don't pay people enough and so on? So it also exposed us to a lot of criticism as being as not following our own rules. So then we reacted in a way, okay, so we are going to talk with them, how they are going to resolve. So let's make some good out of that. Not that we really resolved that, but we were looking for solutions, what we can do in such a situation, that we entered the cooperation unaware of the problem. And of course, very often we are not aware of the problem. And this is why several organizations don't take money from business because, but it wasn't even about money. It was about financial cooperation. And I had a few examples prepared. So, and of course,
I will be slowly cutting you off, Kasia. So
okay.
1 minute to finish off.
1 minute to finish. So,
as well.
So I just want to say that at the end, we know that the way how we, why I think it is important to cooperate with the institutions, because it's not only about money, but it's also about communicating our cause and our values to people who are not these professional idealists, but it's to kind of putting our ideas on the market, and not only to citizens who will follow our cause, but also to those who, they know how to earn money and they judge your values through more pragmatic glasses. And this is why I think somehow it's not that comfortable to say, oh, we are only going to be funded by citizens and that's all, and we have no moral dilemmas. We do have them. And I will stop. You gave me only 1 minute. So
sorry. But that was 1 minute at the end of around 20. So I think that's not too bad. But I do want to really interrupt you because you had such a nice flow that I didn't want to disturb it with my questions, particularly that later on you were addressing a number of questions that I had kind of prepared to ask you. So many thanks for that. But what stems for me from that is that even if you don't seem to have anything written down, there is this very strong feeling of values that came around when the organization was being formed and that actually shaped it. And right now, I think for me, it's very important when you are saying, it was like we couldn't explain it to us to kind of go against certain values because it's so intrinsically in the blood of the organization or some people who are there at the moment, because obviously if there will be rotations, this might change. But that this is exactly what we are looking for, because those are those values that are meant to guide you. But it's also interesting what you've said about the need to verify with whom you work, or if you haven't done it at first, kind of to follow up how we can change it, like this one of the last examples that you gave. I think that's very, very critical. Kind of in our work at Polish Institute, where we kind of, the last years we work more and more with the companies trying to help them develop through workshops kind of more responsible policies on human rights and so on, trying to identify what issues they do have. We kind of came to conclusions that we won't be working with companies where we cannot have early in the process a meeting with somebody from the board, like either CEO or somebody high sitting in the board, so that we can be really sure that it's not a waste of time. It's not a problem to have, you know, a series of workshops. Yes, it's a good money and so on, but it's, you know, we don't want to waste time on doing something that will not bring results. And only if you engage the top management, kind of looking from our perspective, we'll kind of know if this organization is actually willing and ready to start changing its attitude, to start changing its processes, but also to dedicate some funding to the work that they'll need to do. Because obviously, you know, if you have discrimination, you will need to put in some money to do some trainings to actually remediate the issues, to pay people more and so on. But moving now to Maciej, you are obviously the head of the biggest, the oldest Polish NGO, just as Kasia said, with a big portfolio of activities covering all human rights. Can you tell us how it looks like? I mean, I won't be repeating the question, but can you tell us how it works in your case? Do you have any procedures? And if you don't, how you go about ensuring that a large number of people who is employed by Helsinki Foundation actually follows the values that you think are important?
Well, thank you very much. It was super important to what has been said already, and very interesting for me to listen to. And thank you for having me here. We do have quite a lot of experience in various kinds of cooperation with businesses, as this is the main focus of our meeting. And of course, one thing, and probably most usual one, are the attempts to get financial support on the side of those commercial actors on the scene. And this actually proved to be very tricky and difficult, but doable in many, many ways, both in kind and both financially. Over the years, we've been working for 33 years in Poland, and before the establishment of the Helsinki Foundation, there was also the underground operation of the Helsinki Committee during the martial law, but obviously with no financial support from businesses. Getting back to businesses, I think that the major part of our experience in that field is connected with the film festival, because usually film festivals do have commercial donors, and we were also devoting quite much of time and energy into trying to get not only smaller donations and in-kind support that we always have, but also like the big donor would be like strategic one. And we were twice close to getting into cooperation with the multinational corporations, actually having a lot of ethical questions on our minds, but for the better or worse, we actually didn't have to answer those questions too thoroughly, because when it came to the global level, never this kind of support was confirmed. And because of political reasons, because we do screen a lot of different films that are like showing human rights situation worldwide from different angles. And one of those corporations, for example, was entering quite aggressively Chinese market at the moment, and films about Tibet, of course, were not very welcome. And of course, the bottom line was that they cannot interfere with the program in whatsoever way. So there was no outcome of this kind of attempts. Doesn't mean that there are no other cooperations in terms of in-kind or financial support. And I would like to mention, first of all, that there are very different kind of businesses and also different kind of corporations. First of all, let us set apart media, because of course these are also commercial entities. I'm not speaking about public media. And this cooperation also poses lots of ethical questions, actually, but it's not really our focus, as I understand today. But for example, also commercial schools, this is something that that is important. We do cooperate a lot with private schools, also because of this reason that it's more difficult for organizations such as ours to enter public school at the moment in Poland because of the political situation and because of the suspicion that we'll speak about LGBT marriage, for example, or some other issues that might be not welcome. But there is a lot of cooperation in this regard. And also there's a lot of this kind of cooperation that, for example, big entities, big commercial entities, they ask us to conduct trainings for their employees about, for example, anti-discrimination, or even ask us, of course, with some financial benefit on our side to help them draft their anti-discrimination policies. And having experts on that, we can really contribute to this sometimes. And this is I think a fair situation whenever there is a real, as Jubata said, will on the part of the management of the organization, but also some kind of involvement of the team, because without really the diagnosis of the situation, you cannot make it in a sensible way. But then the question is, having quite a lot of experience with those cooperations with businesses, do we have any written policy? We do, but it's a fragmentary one. It deals only with obtaining financial benefits in kind or in cash from commercial legal entities. And it basically says that it is possible that we can do that, but some types of businesses are excluded. And the list is quite long and it's very explicit. So those that produce or trade arms, but also narcotic drugs or psychedelics, but also fossil fuels, also alcohol beverages. And that makes it more difficult. Many human rights film festivals around the world, they've got like beer companies. We used to have a beer company and a very nice cooperation, but we don't have it anymore. And it's because of its clarity and simplicity, it helps on one hand, but on the other hand, if you really are careful then in this assessment, whether a big company is really involved in producing or trading one of those commodities, you'll find out that really many of them are somehow involved. For example, those that like, for example, Airbus. Of course, we know Airbus as building those beautiful big planes for passengers, but also, of course, it's a producer of arms and so on and so on. So in many cases, we had to say no, though the financial contribution, a possible financial contribution was offered. But then what to do in situations which are not on the list? Whether everything goes? Of course not. And this policy says that it's always the decision of the board after a careful consideration of leading institutions and organizations reports about human rights and labor law standards, compliance of those businesses. And this is a tricky part. I've been doing myself this compliance checks. And first of all, what I found out is that in Poland, we don't have really a strong kind of business watch organization that would track down those records for us. And a part of it, if you dig deep and you are facing a bigger organization, financial organization, business organization, you will always find out that there are some incompliances. And the question of gravity of those incompliances is there, of course. So it's always that you have to, in the end, take a case-by-case approach and weigh those issues. And then, am I happy with the decisions that we've made? Almost always with the decisions that were negative, to be very honest, because they are clear. But those positive, well, I was always hesitant. Also because of the fact that you may not know that there are real violations, really grave violations, but then learn out that they are there. And this was one of the cases. We've actually learned from investigative journalists that, for example, one of those corporations really breaks the sanctions, for example, at this very moment in their chains of supply. And so these are those issues that can be really disturbing if you find it out later. And then it's not to say that we shouldn't get any financial support from businesses if they are willing, but it's just to say that it's super difficult and it's super. You have to be really super cautious, and then you will never probably have this 100% clear conscience. It's always like taking a risk. Probably it's a risk that is worth taking if for this money you would like to do something very important and the risk is relatively small, so you didn't find anything really big about those businesses. Of course, some local businesses and small businesses, it might be better, but also not always, because then you don't have this data aggregated by watchdogs and so on and so on. Okay, I'll be brief because we are running out of time. So just very few remarks, a few points that I would like to mention. One thing is already mentioned, the festival. What really works and what is a value, I believe, on the local ground, we did find really trans-sector collaborations, like, for example, of cultural institutions, NGOs, self-governmental institutions, and businesses that, for example, give the room for to the cinema, or pay just 5,000 zlotys for promotion so that posters can be printed. And these are sometimes sustainable. And I think that there is a value in this, because it builds really a community on the local ground, which is a not like this kind of separate community that we are now used to because of polarization of the society, but it's really, like, as I've said, trans-sectoral. Then this whole issue of willingness or unwillingness of businesses to support NGOs or CSOs, or especially human rights NGOs, is also very much connected with the political situation and shrinking or even closing civic space in many countries in the world, and especially in our region of the world. Of course, many businesses are afraid of supporting human rights organizations that are really independent, because that's political and that's against the current government very often. And what helps in this regard, sometimes it's cooperation with their associations, with business associations. And we did have such cooperations, which are like, for example, Polish Business Roundtable, that are really valuable. Sometimes it's just for kind of research and papers. Sometimes it's for something more. For example, one of those associations or umbrella organizations of businesses proposed that if we go into taxation and human rights, that was one of the directions that we were considering in our strategy, they can give their experts and their cases, and we can collaborate. And that would be a sensible, very sensible collaboration. Then another remark, which I think really is important. It's completely different, I believe, here in our region of Europe than in Western Europe, than in Iceland, for example. We are now facing this situation when the new generation of millionaires is coming to power. And these are people who are a little bit different than their parents usually, who are seeking also a kind of, well, to be brief, they want to be philanthropists in a good way. So they also want to learn philanthropy. And they are new initiatives of this kind already in Poland. And I believe that if we get in cooperation with them, and if human rights agenda is present in their studies that they want to do, it's something that can in the end change the culture of supporting NGOs by businesses in this way, that probably it's better than giving a donation by marketing department or CSR department of one or another company, it's better to create special foundations or funds that might be multi-companies funds with kind of experts that could give this money completely independently of the marketing policies. For both sides, it's actually better, I believe, in the long term, because combining marketing with supporting human rights is something super also dangerous in a way. And I can speak from my, at the end of my speech, from my really personal experience, because I've been running this Human Rights Film Festival for many years. It's a niche in a way, but what I learned from this, that what motivates me and my colleagues in the team is actually this very unique and very rare space of freedom. It's super important that we are speaking completely independently from two huge powers that are limiting the discourse of human beings from both sides. One is political propaganda of various kinds, and one is marketing, market and marketing. And like between those two superpowers, there is a very narrow space for really free expression in our world. That's how this world functions, and we should preserve this space. So paying this price of even being perceived by our audiences as someone who might be representing some corporate interests is probably too high a price to pay, even for our own motivation and well-being and really motivation to do our job. What can I say? Just one more thing. One good example, because I want to end on a positive note, is that, for example, it doesn't have to be money, as I've said, and as you've said. It can be also in kind. We are cooperating with Centiwan, which is Polish IT corporation that worked out a very sophisticated tool for analysis of a speech in internet. And then we are using it to monitoring anti-migrant and anti-LGBT hate speech during electoral campaigns in Poland in social media. And the results are really interesting. And also it really needs time of the people. So it's also a mobilization tool, because people are getting devoting their time to this kind of surveys. And then we've got interesting outcomes of those surveys, and we can do reportings about the nature of this hate speech, where it's really like nested and so on and so on. What are the narratives and so on. And they give us for free this program, but also people who are kind of help desk. So this is something which we do value, and this is a nice way of cooperating. And the really last one, we shouldn't forget about those that really dictate how our world looks like. So for example, Google or Facebook, we do cooperate in various instances with them. It's very difficult not to do that. And they offer a lot, and that is really super interesting. But we still have in mind that doing very often strategic litigation, we have been and we might be in the future on the other side of a litigation. We might litigate against them before the court of law. And if they're okay with that and still support us, which we believe is possible, then that's great. But if not, then that's of course tricky. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maciej. I think, again, plenty of ideas raised. We do have just a minute, so just before I also ask for a commentary from Olena Uwarova, who is head of International Lab for Business and Human Rights at Jarosław Mudry National Law University. I just wanted to make one comment, because both Katarzyna and you, Maciej, you've raised this issue of verification of companies. Like, how can we learn what's going on? How we can learn, are they really respecting human rights, or is it just this offer, be it of cooperation or funding, just a way of trying to kind of get something nice to write in the non-financial report at the end of the year? And I think there are, like, what we try to do in various situations, we also turn to trade unions, if there are trade unions in the given company, to kind of get their insights and opinion. Because as you've mentioned, it's not, I mean, no organization is clear of any totally sane and clear of any infringements. But the question is what the organization is doing with that. Do they really trying, do their best to avoid those and train people and react to abuses or not? So we found that going through trade unions sometimes, not always, but often provides us with this insight that, yes, there is this effort to actually do good. And sometimes no, that's just, try a bit of a window dressing from the side of the company. I think I've got good news in that there are some new regulations coming at the EU level about how companies should be reporting about their social issues, environmental performance, and so on. Because so far, to be fair, there are some good reports, non-financial reports, where you can read about what company does to ensure that they respect human rights or labor rights and so on. But very often, it's just much more of the PR tools and something where you can get some really meaningful information. As I said, there are some good ones, but I'm talking mainstream. And this will be changing now with this new coming legislation and the European Unified Standard of Reporting. And so in a way, you gave me inspirations that perhaps we should kind of do a short podcast or something, because we can't monitor all the organizations, but we can be helpful to other NGOs in saying okay, this is what you can look for when you want to try to verify if the business or institutions that you want to go cooperate with, if it makes sense, if it will not undermine your trust with your stakeholders, if it will not kind of hit you, as Katarzyna said, by coming up with some information, like with the case of renting the space or being offered the space to organize the celebrations, and then kind of get this information about this low, like the company not paying sufficient wages. So probably next year we'll come up with, so that's a lesson for me, that we'll come up with this short information set for NGOs where to seek this information. But you've touched on quite strongly on media as well. And for us, at least for me, there was a big question over the weekend, it still is, shall we stay on Twitter, for example? Because that's one of the very best means, and actually the ones that we kind of develop more strongly right now. And now with the whole human rights team being fired from Twitter, although we now get information that they are trying to hire them back because they've realized what the backlash is. But yeah, there was this issue. Shall we be present on the medium that just doesn't seem to understand the importance of respecting human rights when providing such a big platform for communication and kind of not having somebody to moderate? So, a number of things I won't be repeating. We do have just 5 minutes, and I just wanted to give them to Olena. And if there are any questions, please post them right now, because otherwise there won't be a chance to answer. Olena, over to you.
Yeah. First of all, I hear myself. Is it okay? Okay. First of all, I appreciate very much for this discussion and for all presentations. It was extremely interesting, and I have a lot of reflections actually. And the first reflection is more general and maybe even more academic, but still, I think that we need a conversation about human rights responsibilities of non-state actors, because we have these discussions about corporate responsibility to respect human rights, but we know that the dialogue about human rights responsibility is much more broader, and the principles which should be built related to this question are mostly common for many non-state actors. And so yeah, it's interesting what principles of human rights responsibilities should be common for all non-state actors, and where is a difference between these non-state actors and so on. This is, of course, the first one. And related to the region, actually, I have very, very complicated reflections because from one side, we have this post-Soviet past, for post-Soviet heritage, and it impacts still us. Yeah, this impact is still huge, and from one side, we have this feeling, at least in that countries which could be considered as new democracies in the post-Soviet arena, we have this feeling that freedom of associations and civil society is a huge value for democratic developments, and that's why we don't really there is no discussion, I would say, for example, in Ukraine, what rules should be applied to civil society organizations related to their relationships, for example, with business actors or something like that. So it's not an issue because still civil society organizations are considered themselves mostly as watchdogs for the state, first of all, and they don't really involved, still with very few exceptions, they don't really involved to the business and human rights development, but again, we already have few exceptions, and I am glad that we have. From other side, civil society organizations are still very vulnerable actors in this space, and in such complicated environment, it's really hard to find the model of self-regulation even. So it's really hard to develop some even expectations, public expectations from civil society organizations. But again, the situation in the region is very different because we had a conversation, for example, in Kyrgyzstan, and civil society organizations there said that, to be honest, even if some business supports civil society organizations and wants to have the dialogue with civil society organizations and understands that they need to build capacity on business and human rights issues, the business prefers to do it in very, very confidential way, because the state could consider such communication in correct way, and it's still a gray zone for business even to communicate with civil society organizations. So yeah, the region is very different, and also the question about leverage, yeah, for civil society organizations, why civil society organizations should feel this responsibility on human rights and should feel this ethical choice, importance of this ethical choice. It's also important question because there is a parallel with leverage for corporate actors, yes, and we always discuss what could be drivers for companies to be responsible and so on and so forth. What I see, for example, in Ukraine, is that civil society organizations could have some ethical codes and so on if bigger players, for example, I don't want to waste any titles, but if some international organizations, non-governmental organizations, ask them to show this ethical code or something like that. And yeah, and it was said today that it could be in very formal way. So it's not enough to have some real substantive changes. No, so yeah, but thank you again for this discussion, because it's really a lot of reflections about it.
Thank you very much, Elena. And I just wanted to close off. I wanted to give the floor to Sevar, who I've seen was raising the hand, so I assume he wanted also to comment, and we'll be wrapping after that.
Yes, thank you. This has been a fascinating discussion, and I think many of the things that you were talking about actually resonate with things that we have experienced here in Iceland, and I mean these are basically sort of common issues. The sort of intermediaries when it comes to funding are often a very good idea. I mean, they can be different, and Katarzyna actually I think I need to Google what you were talking about, or you might perhaps send me an email.
The name is Benevici.
Benevici, yes, yes. So you know, that's one option, but there are also cases like for example, here in Iceland we have this organization called Festa, which is a sort of a social responsibility network for businesses here in Iceland, and you would expect, you know, at least the founding members of this organization to be, you know, trying to do their best to behave ethically, but there have been actually 2 or 3 scandals involving this group. One of the corporations, which is a funding member of Festa, wanted to support an environmental organization here in Iceland, and did actually, and then they started, you know, publicizing this. But then it appeared that this same company was tearing down their ships, bypassing EU regulations, and doing this in a terribly dangerous and polluting manner. So I mean, and you know, so that's obviously something, you know, the environmental organization, of course, had to issue a statement regarding this, and they were, you know, they just had to say, well, we won't receive any more money from you. So you can never be absolutely sure about the bona fides of the parties that want to donate money. And it's impossible, I think, to set out any rules that are sort of universally applicable, because it's just impossible to know these things in advance, you know. So I think that's one of the problems. What you can do, on the other hand, at least to my way of thinking, and in the reality that we have on the ground in Iceland, is to work on our core values, to have this conversation about our core values, so that we are clear on what we stand for when we make these case-by-case decisions that we are always going to be faced with. And I think that's, for example, what Katarzyna was, you know, what was apparent is that you have a very clear view of who you are and what your goals are and values, and that guides your decisions. So that's where we need to, you know, focus, and at least, you know, trying not to sound like a salesperson here. One of the benefits of having a code of ethics and having a code of ethics which is a living document, which is, you know, that the organization and the people working in it can internalize these values. So, but again, thank you for your wonderful comments. It's been educational for me. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Zafar. And I couldn't have put it better to summarize the discussion. I wanted to touch on the core values, and no need for me to do that now. Katarzyna?
Just wanted to say that we have a code of ethics, but it depends. It refers to other issues, and this is a living document. We have ethical committee, and we have to, from time to time, we discover that it's limited, and we have to have more discussions. So I do agree, absolutely. It's just that it refers to our own independent. It somehow refers to that, but it doesn't treat in such details as we were talking today. More about our independence from the authorities.
Many thanks, Katarzyna. And Maciej?
Just to clarify, of course, we also do have a code of ethics. I was just referring to this very fragmentary policy that is strictly about business and us. But of course, yeah, otherwise, I do also agree that having our own code of ethics is the beginning of everything, and it's important.
And I should admit that for us, part of the reasons why we wanted to hold this webinar is simply because we are in the process of working or kind of discussing again our values and how we want to go forward, because we don't have a code of ethics kind of written down or code of conduct. And but we are now working on developing some more standardized procedures. And for us so far, it was this kind of feeling of the values that was guiding us. And for example, we would enter into cooperation with a company which wants to change, because I mean, they need to have external expertise to help them to get on this way. But for example, we wouldn't possibly, for example, accept funding to do something else from this company in order not to compromise, kind of not to lose trust and credibility of the stakeholders. So. So it is important for us, and I wanted to thank you again very much for your reflections and sharing of practices, because also for us, it's really invaluable material for us to know and reflect on, also while working to improve our own organization as it grows, as it changes, and kind of enters different new areas of cooperation with different stakeholders. So many thanks for your time, particularly that I know that for everybody, November is a tragically busy month. So the more thank you for taking your time to talk to us today, to share your reflections, share your practices. And yeah, I do hope that we'll have a chance to meet pretty soon. And till then, I do recommend that everybody just looks at the website of your organizations and learn what you do. Thanks so much. Thank you very much to all. And we'll meet. Thank you. And we'll meet for the next webinar on the 24th of November, and we'll look into how we can hold corporations accountable, both in the courts, but also in NCPs and in other non-judiciary fora. Thank you so much.